Yes, Subhash, you can start with the session. Over to you, please.
All right, Chanakya, thank you, guys. All right, guys, thank you for coming in today. Like I said, my name is Subhash Sharma. I'm the speaker for the day. I work with Redington closely on the Azure technologies. I'm the cloud advisor. All right, so today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the cloud adoption journey, migration, site recovery, and whatnot. Trust me, guys, covering all that topics in an hour's time is kind of a challenge. However, we're going to touch base of everything that is there on the screen for a couple of quick topics and important personas. And should you guys have any question, please do park it for the end of this Q&A session, and I'll take it from there. Now, the reason we are here today is to discuss about the importance of the cloud business for the industry and from the technology perspective as well. All right. First thing, thank you guys again. The challenge with our on-prem environment now, it becomes very daunting when it comes to the scalability and the management of the infrastructure. And that is the only main reason I would say, which is very vital to the industry to know why we need to move to the cloud. Now, when we talk about moving to the cloud, there are a lot of factors that will influence the price, and there are a lot of aspects that we also need to understand before we adopt that technology. All right. There are a few tools by the Microsoft, okay, I mean, from the Microsoft given to the community to analyze their pricing before they adopt infrastructure as service or any of the cloud offerings, So when we talk about adopting cloud, we have the Azure total cost of ownership calculator that will actually calculate your current on-prem investment if in case you put up another site and want to gauge your pricing that you will be investing and the ROI, and then you have the Azure migration tool, which is inbuilt within the portal that can actually help you to assess your environment and quickly advise you about the readiness of your environment and will tell you how soon you can actually and what are the resources that can be migrated easily. All right. So when we talk about Azure, we know Azure is a cloud offering by Microsoft. The services are rendered over the internet like compute, technology, and network. Uh, Data center are span across, the global region, 184 countries, and then probably 54 region. Every region is independent of their own power, cooling, network, compute, and storage. So when we talk about Azure, we talk about leveraging services over the internet. Now, the question to the community or the question that comes to my mind is how are we going to actually leverage the services? The first thing that is you need to have an account with Microsoft, and that's the first basic thing. And that is nothing but your Microsoft account. Once you have the Microsoft account activated, you need to have subscription to use those services over the internet. Now, services are nothing but a logical grouping of Azure resources that is linked to an Azure account. For example, uh, the domain name of my company is contoso.com. That's again for illustration purpose, guys. So the company name is Contoso India Private Limited, and I have the domain name as contoso.com. So the first thing when I subscribe to the account, I get something called as default domain name. That is contoso.onmicrosoft.com. Now, once you have that domain account registered with your Azure account, you can then introduce your own custom domain and start using the services. So the purpose of this logical grouping is to only isolate your production environment from the non-production environment and for the management purpose, guys. If you would see the kind of subscription that one can enroll is the development subscription for your UAT purpose, your test subscription again for somebody who want to actually check about the compatibility of the services that are running on-prem, They can actually sign up for the account, enroll for subscription, use your services over the cloud in a POC environment, kind of a test subscription, and then subscribe production. Then you can move your entire workload to the production environment, and thus that's the subscription for your production environment. So by grouping this resources into an isolated environment gives you a leverage to manage the resources efficiently for your billing, for your policies and whatnot. Once you have the thought in your mind that you are actually in the cloud, and you want to have your on-prem environment, that's your native Active Directory connected to the Azure cloud to leverage the services that the Azure AD has to offer, you can have the Azure AD Connect be connected to your on-prem environment, then sync all of your on-prem identities to the cloud. Thus, it becomes the synchronized identity over the cloud that can actually help you leverage the identity management services when it comes to the confidentiality of the resources that can be managed with privileged identity access and the other services that the solution has to offer. When we talk about the Azure platform, uh, here I want to talk about the platform in various ways. When I talk about the platform in various ways, we all know that the Azure clouds are typically divided into three major categories, like infrastructure as service, software as service, platform as service. Okay, now to categorize what I mean by infrastructure as service, I'm going to purely talk about the virtual machine that I have. Lifting up a server which is physical on-prem and just moving it over to the cloud, that will just become as kind of an relatable thought as infrastructure as service. Now, when we talk about platform as service, I purely talk about all the resources, the services that are associated with platform as service are fully managed by Microsoft. So there's a thin line between choosing the solution and understanding the shared responsibility model that the Microsoft has to offer. Now, when you are pretty much confident that you're going to actually have your infrastructure as service be spun up in the Azure cloud, well, you need to know the pricing of the services that you'll be using. We all know cloud is purely consumption-based model, which means you will pay for what you use. However, there's a benefit that you get over the consumption-based model. There, you can leverage the Azure hybrid benefit. Now, what is Azure? What is Azure hybrid benefit? Azure hybrid benefit is a service. I wouldn't say service, kind of an add-on benefit that Microsoft has to offer to the community. Uh, Using that benefit, the customer can leverage their on-prem existing license with software assurance. With software assurance, guys, mind you, if your licenses, for example, okay, let me put it in a very layman language. For your file server, which is hosting over Windows environment, you have your Windows licenses procured. If those licenses are procured with software assurance, you can redeem those licenses over the Azure Cloud Virtual Machine. Thus, you save the price on the licensing factor. At the same time, there are different tier of pricing. When I say different tier of pricing, broadly, one is the pay-as-you-go model, which purely means you pay for what you use, and then you have reserve instance. Reserve instance is another benefit that the customer or the partner or the business can actually leverage by only knowing for the fact that they're gonna reserve some amount of resources for their usage and gain some more discount. To explain that in layman language, you tell Mr. Microsoft, I will be using your virtual machine for 1 year with the compute of 12 gig RAM. Okay, that suffices my application workload. I can apply reserve instance and gain some more discount. We're going to talk about this reserve instance mathematics while I demonstrate, if time permits, at the end of this session, guys. Now, moving further, as I mentioned, you can leverage Azure hybrid benefit, and the Microsoft ecosystem is so versatile, right? All the applications are actually work which hand in hand can gain some more benefits, So introducing this unique hybrid experiences with Azure that actually helps you to save your money. And then you have those services that are there over the cloud be in a very sophisticated environment. When I say very sophisticated environment, because you are actually using your on-prem licenses to redeem it over to the cloud. That saves you money. You have Azure Reserve instances that can actually save you more money. And then you have the built-in security as well that will ensure that all of your workload are protected with the strictest confidence. Now, why we want to talk about migrating to the Azure, all right? Because first thing, we need, there are a lot of trigger, when we talk about trigger, there may be need of somebody who just don't want to actually invest in the real estate onto the next building, and doesn't want to introduce more capital expenditure, you know onto their on-prem site, because capital expenditure is the expenditure wherein the business paid proactively to procure the asset and then use the services. So the ROI on that concept is kind of daunting when it comes to measure the benefits. However, over the cloud, which is purely an operational expenditure, the ROI can be measured because you have the cost and management utility which are inbuilt to the portal that can actually help you to analyze the costs that are being consumed by your resources. For example, you have your HR department, you have 5 users for your HR department, and they're going to spin up their own web server. Well, what you can do is you can isolate the HR department altogether into the subscription and then monitor the behavior. That is, see how these guys are utilizing their resources in terms of costing and whatnot. So that's the beauty, I would say. When you have such inbuilt tools available over the Microsoft portal, that actually helps you to measure your ROI. So when we talk about migrating to the Azure cloud, there are a lot of factors, as I mentioned earlier. But what are we migrating? We are migrating our workloads that are down in the on-prem ground. They are nothing but your Windows physical server. Maybe you have a beefy server with 256 gig RAM, and then you have your powerhouse like your virtualized environment like ESXi or Citrix or VMware for the fact. You want to move that workload? Yeah, sure, you do. You have the assessment, through the Azure Migrate tool that can do the assessment for you, and you can do the lift and shift. Just move your virtual machine to the Azure cloud. Boom, the job is done. You have your app services in the cloud that can actually be beneficial for somebody, for an app developer, like somebody, who just wants to focus on his efficiency of developing the codes and doesn't want to bother about the underlying infrastructure. He can, or they can actually directly enroll for the platform as service, spin up the server, and boom, the job is done. It doesn't have to worry about how much compute that my server would need and what point I would need to scale the environment to ensure that in the event of a spike, my server justify the bandwidth. So when we have a thought, all right, to move in the cloud, the inbuilt tool, all right, we just don't have to worry about how we're gonna actually migrate to the Azure cloud. We have tools in place. We need to have a good strategic plan. When I talk about good strategic plan, well, from my experience, all right, if I have to guide or do uh, the assessment of some business to move to the cloud? Well, there are a lot of ways. First thing is that you need to plan. You need to identify the workloads that you have in your own house. When I say own house, I mean your in-house environment, guys. Okay. So uh, the best practice, let me put it this way. All right. First thing first, you create the account, enroll for the UAT environment in the cloud. So the step one over the cloud is done. Back to the on-prem environment. When you have the on-prem environment, you do the assessment. You do the assessment by using the default tools available uh, within the Azure Migrate Blade. So with that tool, All right, the process and the configuration server will be deployed in the environment that will do all the job for you and will spit out its finding, and you will get to know the readiness of your environment, whether you are good to migrate or what are the weak points that you need to overcome. That's one part of the story. The second part of the story, which is very important, is first thing first, you need to identify what type of workload you have, how swiftly that workload can be moved over to the cloud, or what are the additional security you would need to move that workload to the cloud. In a layman language, let me put it this way. For a business to have that in the cloud, you need to identify the mission critical and the non-mission critical workload targeted first to be in the cloud. Now, we all know that Azure, as mentioned earlier, it has been broadly divided into three different categories like infrastructure as service, platform as service. So now let me just actually talk about platform as service, which is a very seamless integration. When I say very seamless integration, the services that the platform as service has to offer, it's very simple. I would say in 30 odd good minutes, the environment could be up and running. Again, guys, mind you, this is just kind of a hypothetical situation, and it will also depend on the workload and the front-end development and the back-end engine used by the app developer as well before you spin up. But what we're going to talk about now here is, now, we all know to put up a web application, you might use Linux, you might use Windows Server, use the Internet Information Services, the web service of the Windows-based platform. Those are two typical environments that can be used to publish an app or a website. However, over the cloud, you enroll for the platform as service, subscribe for the app plan. And what are they? For the free tier, you get 1 gig disk space, and there are the available values and the attributes I can see. All right. So with this, you don't have to worry about scaling up and scaling out. Scale out is nothing but adding more machines to your environment as opposed to scale up. Scale in, scale out, scale in is actually, or rather scale up is actually, adding more resources to your own virtual machine or to your compute. Okay, for example, you have a virtual machine spin up with 2 gig RAM. Okay, there's a need of more power to it. You add up more memory to it. That's scale up. Scale out means adding more virtual machine to your workload so that it can suffice the uh, traffic it has actually been hit. You know, so when in that scenario, a developer whose job is to actually manage the application itself doesn't have to worry about adding more resources, adding more compute, adding more maintenance investment onto that environment. When we talk about Azure Logic apps, now let me put it in a very simple manner. We all know what task scheduler is, which is an inbuilt feature of our Windows operating server. All right, the job of the task scheduler is to run a particular task at an interval and spit out the job. The same thing is with the Azure Logic app. It is a cloud service used to schedule, automate, orchestrate tasks, business process, and workflows. You need to achieve or fire something, write up a code, let it trigger at particular time of the day, and that will do the job for you. That's the beauty of the Azure Logic apps. Now, when we talk about the Azure migration and modernization scenario, we know that we need to have something in place. And what is that something? Maybe a strategy, maybe a framework, maybe a kind of a new landscape altogether before we start the migration. So that's the first thing that we will be talking today when it comes to uh, adopting the cloud journey. That is nothing but the strategies involved. Rehost. What is rehost? Rehost means nothing but lifting an on-prem server and moving and shifting it to the cloud, lift and shift as is. Refactor, as I mentioned earlier, right? Back in the old days, we used to spin up server, and then we used to configure the web services role, all right, for the IIS and whatnot. So there we spin up a server, and then the role was established onto that server, and thus the web app was published. However, in the cloud, you don't have to worry about it. You can just publish it over the web using platform as service. So that's kind of an shifting of the platform that's considered as a refactor, which is the modernization environment, and then re-architect, building your or doing some amendments to your current application, which can be compatible with the cloud offerings and the native software as service. The best example of the software as service is nothing but your Exchange online plans, your O365, your N365 plans. All right, everything is powerhouse in the cloud. You just have to access your mailbox, your OneDrive, and the data. All right. So that's the best example of software as service. Everything is managed by the Microsoft. All right. And the administrator just has to monitor the environment using the admin portal, and that's about it. So when we talk about migrating to infrastructure as service, platform as service, or software as service, we know that we have file server environment, we have the SQL server, we have the app and whatnot, the other critical workloads. Well, everything that is associated with our line of business can get moved to the cloud. However, the face has to be defined. All right. Maybe what you can do is, for example, for a file server, all right, I want to actually have a file server move to the cloud. So if I were to do that, all right, so I would certainly do it. But let me do it this way, or rather, I know that the Azure storage can actually have my file share be mapped to the end user account. So in that way, I can eliminate the NAS box, which is on-prem, and can leverage the services from the cloud itself. I can do that. Yeah, that's doable. For somebody moving the SQL server, platform as service, go for it. And the same goes with the Linux and the SAP environment as well, guys. Now, in a scenario, all right, in a scenario of migrating the application to the Azure infrastructure as service. Okay, when we talk about migration using the Azure Site Recovery or uh, using the infrastructure as service, all right, we're talking about Rehost, all right, that's the strategy, the first R of the cloud adoption journey, all right. You want to move your VMware environment, you have your VMware assessment be ready onto the cloud. And when I say onto the cloud, using the Migrate tool, and then that service, the workload can get migrated. Same as with the Azure database. When I say Azure database, I mean platform as service. We spoke about it. What we speak. Now, someone wants to move their SQL database, which is there on the on-prem environment, directly connect to the account using the platform as service, and let the management tool of the SQL connect to the cloud-based identity, and then let the import and export of the data can happen. That makes your life more easy. So for an app developer or the ID administrator, they don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier. Everything is done by the tool itself, all right, and managed by Microsoft. When we talk about benefits over the cloud, all right, you don't have to worry about the availability of the resources, scalability of the resources, the governance, and the security, because the length and breadth, all right, of the Microsoft security is so robust and diversified. All right, you have the NSGs in your environment, right, introduce, which kind of an act as a permit deny, just in case if you need to actually discard the firewall for a quick reason and test that service. All right. Now, when we talk about Azure migration journey and tools, let us see what are the choices of tools that we have and what other business case could be. For assessment, we have the Azure Migrate, we have the Data Migration Assistant, we have the SQL Server Migration Assistant. Well, that's purely for your environment to get assist. And then you have the Migrate, you have the ASR, you have ASR is nothing but the Azure Site Recovery. The purpose of the ASR. This is kind of a dilemma that I've been seen in a lot of people's mind. All right, the backup and the ASR. Right now, too early to talk about ASR. Let me just actually talk about it now. When we talk about Azure Site Recovery, the purpose of that site recovery services is actually uh, achieving the goal of the business continuity with the disaster recovery. The backup altogether is a different story as opposed to the ASR. The purpose of the backup is to back up your files and folders from an on-prem environment, maybe a server to the over cloud, maybe in the vault. That's kind of protecting your files and folders. However, in the event of the on-prem failure, you can fail over the cloud. That's the purpose of that ASR site recovery. And then you have the optimized method to be adopted to optimize the environment by using a cloud Azure advisor. To optimize your billing, you have cost management billing. Summarizing the cloud migration strategies in a nutshell. Okay, someone with lift and shift as is, all right, infrastructure as service. Why I say as is, you have a file server, there is no need for further amendments. Boom, spin up a server in the infrastructure as service and have your server spin up. The benefit of migrating your workload to the Azure cloud are various. For your business to forecast the investment. When I say forecasting the investment, I purely talk about the capital expenditure. So the capital expenditure is actually cut down when it comes to the operational expenditure. For somebody, all right, who just wanna minimally alter the on-prem environment to take the advantage of the cloud, you have the platform as services. And then for someone who want to actually have everything built in the cloud, directly move all your workload and start from the scratch, that's rebuilding the environment from the cloud. We have a lot of tool, as I mentioned earlier, right? The Azure migration, the assessment, and the optimization tool. But then, well, what are the motivation? When we talk about motivation, I mean, what are the reason you want to move it to the cloud, and what is the availability of the business when it comes to the motivation of moving to the cloud, and who you gonna actually approach? We as the consultant, we as the cloud advisor and the solution architect actually plays, and the partners like you guys and the customers, who want to actually move to the cloud can approach somebody, look forward, right, to their advisory, be engage with the customer, with the partner, with the business, understand the business goal, understand the workload, and then define the strategy. Once that is done in place, you have the offers, all right, some promotional offers running by the Microsoft for this particular quarter or the month can be availed, and the workload could be moved. When I started off with Azure, all right, a good long time ago, maybe I would, if somebody, all right, wants to have the workload moved, my advice would be let the assessment be done. Once that is done, uh, you can create a POC environment over the cloud, or get in touch with your cloud solution partner or your channel manager, right? And be funded on the POC environment. Test your application compatibility, check the pattern, check the behavior, how cloud is being suited for your own environment. And then start moving on to the cloud with your non-critical workloads. once the non-critical workloads are moved into the cloud, you have ample amount of time to see the behavior, check on the billing, check on the performance, and then you can move all into the cloud. Now, the best practice example when building a business case with cloud, as I mentioned earlier, gather the inventory. When I talk about gather the inventory, I mean assessing the environment, right? With Azure Migrate or some third-party tools that the partner may have, which may they have been using from good long time. All right. When we talk about assessing the environment, guys, you need to engage with the customer, with the business community in a very righteous manner. You need to understand, all right, put the customer, put the business in the comfort that they are open to talk about their own environment. And then you can, once the information is gathered, you have the Azure pricing calculator or published over the web. You have the web that is azure.com/pricing that can tell you moving a file server on an on-prem with 4 gig RAM and some capacity, what is the actual cost? Do the real-time comparison, and then you have the Azure total cost of ownership calculator that do the justice for you by understanding the real estate cost, understanding the power consumption, understanding the maintenance that you will be investing on to your on-prem environment, you know. So once that has been done collectively, there is the time where you will start shifting to the cloud. As I mentioned earlier, right, for someone who's using a beefy server and have the virtualized environment with VMware, Citrix, and ESXi and Hyper-V, maybe, you know. So we have tools like VMware Assessment for VMware environment, and then you have the Windows and Linux assessment done. They are nothing but all for you readily available for free. So you don't have to worry, you don't have to, you know, deep dive how this goal could be achieved. You have the tools, everything in place will do the handling for you to understand that you need to move to the cloud now. Now, for somebody, all right, who would be thinking like I'm thinking now, all right, I have an on-prem environment. I know that I'm moving to the cloud. How I am ensuring that my business would be highly available in the event of failure, how this goal could be achieved, all right, and what are the cost factors involved in achieving this business goal. Now, the on-prem environment can be moved and replicated to the Azure cloud using the Azure Site Recovery. You have a zero app data loss, nearly zero downtime, a test migration to minimize risk, and it's nothing but a free ASR usage during migration. Now, let me talk about the migration using the ASR. Now, when we talk about using the ASR as a migration tool, all right, uh, in the scenario of a rehost, that's nothing but, guys, lift and shift. I would have the on-prem, the process and the config server be spun up in the environment and let it do the job of replicating it to the cloud. So over the control panel, over the control plane and the data plane, you have the communication established. As you know, that the communication in the infrastructure happens at two major layers. One at the service level, and another is the IP-based communication. All right. So when you have this layered approach, when I say layered approach, I mean migrating of the workload from the on-prem to the cloud. The availability is one thing which is very important. Okay. So the highly available environment in Azure cloud is with various reasons. Every resource in the cloud is defined with their respective SLI, because you have the premium services, you have non-premium services. For example, the premium storage solid state drive, which has the highly availability of 99.9% as compared to the other services. Now, the availability set, availability zone, site recovery and region pair, well, they are nothing but backed by the Microsoft to ensure that your environment is available. You know, the availability set is nothing but that protects your virtual machine against failures within the data center. As I mentioned earlier, all right, each data center in the regions are individually powered and with their own cooling, compute, and whatnot. And then you have the availability zone. All right, a zone is comprises of one or more, maybe three data centers. That becomes a zone, which is based geographically and also paired with another region. For example, somebody in UAE North, all right, if your customer base in UAE North, so the closest region that you're going to select for your customer could be the UAE North. Again, this is again a hypothetical situation, guys, just for the illustration purpose to understand this availability. Now, I have a server spun up in the Azure cloud using infrastructure as service in UAE North. All right. I could have the DR, the disaster recovery site, be spun up in the UA Central if the service is available. So the region is also paired. North is paired with Central, South, West, East, West. So that's the availability of the resources in the event of failure, which is kind of a hypothetical situation again. When we talk about the Azure Site Recovery, the complete migration and the disaster recovery, guys, the important thing that you need to understand now is, for example, you are moving to the cloud. All thoughts in place, everything is done. Your all the efforts of gathering inventory, assessing the pricing calculator, all that ownership has been done completely. Now, when we talk about site recovery, when we talk about the disaster recovery, few things we need to understand as the strategist, all right? First thing first, you cannot fail back from the cloud to the physical box on the on-prem environment. What did I just say? Maybe some rocket science? No, guys. For example, you have a physical server, file server. You have a copy of the file server in the cloud, right? Just don't worry about how this is going to happen. We're going to talk about it on a single engagement if anyone would like to know further about it. So the replication will happen between the on-prem environment to the cloud. That's the ASR, the part of the ASR component. The vault, which is where the information is stored about your on-prem file server, the vault will spin the server in the event of the on-prem server going down. So technically speaking, guys, you would have the ASR configuration server in your environment doing all the config for you, replicating the data between back and forth. Okay, when I say back and forth, I purely mean from the on-prem to the cloud. In the event of failure, you will have to spin the server manually over the cloud. What are the cost? Fixed cost. Guys, the first thing first, you're paying for the ASS servers. The second thing that you're going to pay is for the storage account. The third thing that you're going to pay is for the outbound data transfer at the egress port, right? You're going to pay for the replication. So these are the factors that you need to actually understand while provisioning the Azure Site Recovery. A replication can happen from a private cloud to Azure, any cloud, and Azure to Azure. The key capabilities, as I mentioned earlier, all right, the instance of your on-prem environment is protected in the vault. You have the best-in-class RPO, that's your recovery point objective, and the RDO. The RPO is, as you know, the amount of data loss a business can afford in the event of downtime. And you can actually do a drill. When I say you can actually do a drill, I'm not talking about the fire drill, which is kind of a fake thing just to ensure that the business has achieved the BCP by the compliance score. However, over the Azure Site Recovery services, you can perform the test drill and the production drill. to ensure that everything that has been configured will work as per the goal that you have been defined. Perform a drill with no production impact. Decide when you want to fail over applications. Restore applications to primary data center. DR for compliance need. So these are the key considerations. It comes to the thought of the business when provisioning the disaster recovery solution. For somebody, all right, thinking back in the mind now while sitting at the desk, sipping a cup of coffee, right, I can do the recovery by putting up another physical site. But guy, you're gonna actually invest money on the real estate, then you're gonna invest more money onto the power consumption, capital expenditure. A wink of an eye, the ASR services can be provisioned, and you have uh, a sound sleep, all right, in the event of failure while you have provisioned the disaster recovery over the Azure cloud. So it cut down all the efforts or cut down all the worry that a business has when it comes to provisioning of the site recovery solutions over to the cloud. Now, what we see now is a multi-region design. When I say multi-region design, I'm purely talking from a tech perspective, an environment which is highly available as an active DR. Okay, an active DR is nothing but you have two regions running parallelly. All right, and you do the load balance by using the all the mechanism by putting up the load balancer and the front door and the other networking appliance that does the load balancing for you. All right, this is kind of a multi-tier architect in place. For example, the traffic coming from the internet gets terminated to the traffic manager, and thus the load is balanced. From the primary region, you have a web tier. Oh, now the web tier is actually spun up in three different servers. So that's kind of a multi-tier architect that has uh, load balance the application to ensure that it is highly available. Okay, and then for the management purpose, you have that Azure Bastion subnet. Well, Bastion can be accessed without the public address. All right, it's kind of a jump box that you jump over and control the entire environment for the management purpose. And then you have the VNet peering that talks to both the network simultaneously. The Azure Site Recovery architect, it's very simple. All right. The first one that we saw was kind of a highly available environment, active, technically. Here, building up the disaster recovery with Azure Site Recovery, it's kind of a passive environment, you know. So there's a failure, the business on the ground needs to restore. Well, you can actually have the workload be published from the cloud manually, and thus the business is affected for some amount of downtime. For somebody who can afford the amount of downtime, depending on the business nature, they could have those ASR be introduced into their environment as the passive DR services. Now, the region 2, okay, is your first region. I'm so sorry, that's your recovery side, and the region 1 is the primary. Now, in the event of failure, as I mentioned earlier, the solution architect or probably the guy who is managing the environment will have to spin up the server manually to ensure that the services are actually available. So with this, you understand the basic concept of the passive DR, the active DR, and the need of this disaster recovery. Now, if you have any questions, uh, I'll be happy to address them all. And let me actually take you to the portal right away where I can show you about the tenant and the best practice of using the subscription and the management, and maybe a quick walkthrough of 5 servers and analyzing the cost. If you have any questions, guys, please park it over to the chat box. I'm going to move on to my pricing calculator back and forth. We're going to toggle the screen to understand if we have any questions. All right, so I'm going to minimize this. All right, I'm going to, for the pay-as-you-go price model, the OS price is included. I will pay $154.76. Just for the instance, I did not add the hard disk, did not add the networking part to it. So, as I mentioned,